Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm David Luban, and I've had the incredible pleasure this past year of being in our AI ethics seminar, the research seminar at the Stockdale Center, with our fellows and with Ed and with a couple of other people and a couple of mids. I'm about to introduce three of our fellows. You earlier heard Jovana, who was our fourth fellow this year. Before I do the introductions, I'd just like to say that these fellowships and also my own position as professor of ethics exist because of the generosity of alumni of this institution. And I would, if any are here, I'd like to just give special thanks. I'll start with myself to the class of 1965. Jovana is funded by the class of 1962. Dr. Leonard Kahn, who I'll introduce in a moment, is by Freeman Fallow. Dr. Richard Dean, the class of 1958, and Dr. Patrick Smith by the class of 1973. So if there are any alumni, thank you so much for making this possible. If none of them are here, I'd just like all of you to know that, that it is the alumni that really have the vision to have the Stockdale Center's fellows, the ethics position, and the conference. With that, let me introduce our speakers. Dr. Leonard Kahn at the far end is an associate professor of philosophy at Loyola University of New Orleans. His teaching and research are in moral theory and applied ethics, especially the intersection between just war theory and the ethics of technology. He's edited 3 books and numerous articles in book chapters. His book reviews, some of which were co-written with his Loyola undergraduates, have appeared in top philosophy journals, Ethics, Philosophy and Review, and Metapsychology. Dr. Patrick Smith, in the middle, is assistant professor of ethics and technology in the Department of Philosophy at the University of Twente in the Netherlands. Before going to the Netherlands, Patrick was a postdoc at the McCoy Center for Ethics in Society at Stanford University and assistant professor of political science and global studies at the National University of Singapore. He is working on the intersection of global justice and emerging climate issues, but also very much involved in ethical issues of new technology and the intersection with just war theory. And nearest to where I will be sitting is Dr. Richard Dean, who is professor of philosophy at Cal State University of Los Angeles. He did his PhD at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And taught at Rutgers and the American University in Beirut before taking his current position. His main areas of research are Kant's ethics, contemporary normative moral theory, and various subjects in applied ethics, including the interest in the ethics of AI. He's written a book called The Value of Humanity in Kant's Moral Theory, and is the editor of the collection Respect, subtitled Philosophical Essays. So with that, I'm just going to turn the floor over to Leonard. And I do want to say it was an incredible pleasure working with these people this year, just to let the record show.
Well, thanks very much for that introduction, David. Much appreciated. So composing this talk has made very clear to me how much I've learned from my time as a residential fellow at the Stockdale Center. And in particular, this talk is a shortened version of a paper that itself only scratches the surface of my experiences here. Since I'm unlikely to have a better opportunity to do so, I'd like to thank Joe, Ed, the members of the Stockdale Seminar, my fellows, Richard, Patrick, and Jovana, and everyone at the center for their hospitality and support. Much appreciated. Now, as a result of the fact that this talk is a shortened version of a paper, there are a number of places in it where I make rather large leaps, and there are places where I ignore areas that cry out for more thorough exploration. I think all this is probably unavoidable under the circumstances, but I'm happy to try to retrace my steps in the Q&A to help remedy these infelicities if people are interested in doing so. This isn't the flashiest part of the paper I keep referring to, and it's not the most original part either, but it's the right part for 3 p.m. on a Friday. So, you're welcome. So, let me remind you that much of the literature concerning the ethics of lethal autonomous weapons, or laws as they're usually called, has focused on the idea of human dignity, and the lion's share of that literature has been devoted to arguing that one, the use of laws without meaningful human control violates human dignity. So, 2, their use is morally prohibited, and therefore 3, should be illegal. By the way, some people who've spoken today and yesterday have really sent their slides to the gym. It's impressive. My slides obviously skipped a lot of leg days, so sorry about that. Peter Sarro provides an admirably clear statement of the view that I'm talking about here when he writes, and I'm quoting him here, "As a matter of preservation of human morality, dignity, justice, and law, we cannot accept an automated system making the decision to take a human life. We should respect this by prohibiting autonomous weapons systems." Call this view prohibitionism. While there's much to be said in favor of prohibitionism, I take a different but related approach in this little paper. In particular, I sketch an underexplored alternative to prohibitionism and briefly offer some considerations in favor of it. I conclude by suggesting some implications for the development of laws. In order to understand this alternative view a little better, it'll be helpful to take a step back and take a look at the broader conceptual landscape. To that end, consider 2 claims that will be of central importance throughout my discussion. The first of these is the permissibility claim. With respect to considerations of human dignity, it is morally permissible to use laws. The second is the requirement claim. And with respect to considerations of human dignity, it's morally required to use laws. There are a number of ways to mix and match evaluations of the permissibility claim and the requirement claim, but only 2 are important here. First, prohibitionists are committed to the view that both the permissibility claim and the requirement claim are always false. Second, the alternative that I'll explore maintains that both the permissibility claim and the requirement claim are sometimes true and sometimes false, depending on context, particularly on the state of technological development. I'll call this view weak restrictionism. More about weak restrictionism in just a moment. But right now, I owe you a few words about the idea of human dignity, though, of course, I can only treat the topic superficially in the time I have available. It's important to begin by acknowledging frequent complaints that human dignity is a useless concept, or in the words of Steven Pinker, a squishy, subjective notion hardly up to the heavyweight moral demands assigned to it. We should recall that complaints of this kind about human dignity are not new or unique to discussion of laws. Michael Rosen reminds us that Schopenhauer denounced talk of the dignity of man as, and I'm quoting Schopenhauer here, the shibboleth of all perplexed and empty-headed moralists who conceal behind that imposing expression their lack of any real basis of morals, or at any rate, of one that has meaning. Of course, it's easy to caricature and then ridicule the idea of human dignity. This is a tempting mistake, but it's still a mistake. While there's no doubt both that the concept is not fully understood and that competing interpretations of it are often difficult to operationalize, we can try to make some progress. So here goes. Okay. Sorry, I think I'm a bit behind on my slides. There we are. For the purposes of this paper, I understand human dignity as a status concept. A little more precisely, human dignity concerns the moral standing that human beings have in virtue of the intrinsically valuable features that characterize mature members of our species. According to this way of thinking, human dignity can play the role of justifying international humanitarian law and international human rights law. Actions and attitudes that treat human beings as if they lacked these valuable qualities are threats to human dignity, since they treat us in ways that are humiliating. Well, this is not the place to offer a robust account of the basis of human dignity. I'll fall in line with a tradition of grounding, to at least some extent, to some degree, human dignity in personal autonomy, by which I mean our capacity to govern ourselves in light of our authentic values suitably understood. Now that we have a bare bones account of human dignity, let's work our way back to prohibitionism and weak restrictionism by way of the principle of discrimination. This principle, you'll remember, requires us both to distinguish between enemy combatants and non-combatants and to avoid targeting the latter for harm. Some prohibitionists connect the idea that the use of laws is a violation of human dignity with the idea that their use transgresses against the principle of discrimination. Their use transgresses against the principle of discrimination on this line of thinking because the sensory systems of laws are incapable of distinguishing reliably between combatants and non-combatants, because there's no algorithm for determining whether someone is a combatant or a non-combatant, and because laws lack higher order situational awareness that would promote the capacity to make these distinctions. This is, I acknowledge, a very incomplete list of complaints. One might also add that laws are likely to have a hard time recognizing attempts to surrender, but this will do. All of this, if true, shows that the use of laws could be a violation of the principle of discrimination, but a further argument would be necessary to show that this violation would also constitute an offense against human dignity. Satisfactory arguments of this sort can be harder to find, but a promising start can be found with the observation that actions that ignore the distinction between combatants and non-combatants thereby fail to recognize and treat appropriately the value of personal autonomy, namely the personal autonomy of those who've chosen not to become combatants and who have, in the process, rendered themselves essentially defenseless against the use of armed force. If we transgress against the principle of discrimination, then we treat humans as if they were non-humans who cannot make the choice to refrain from harming others by not engaging in military service and in the process rendering themselves vulnerable, indeed, mortally vulnerable to others. In doing so, we blatantly ignore one of the characteristic features of our species, personal autonomy, a feature that makes our lives intrinsically valuable. I think we should grant the prohibitionists the claim that violations of the principle of discrimination are infringements of human dignity in more or less the way that I've just suggested. And I think we should also acknowledge that the use of laws can be violations of the principle of discrimination, especially given their fairly crude level of development at the moment. Hence, it's at least sometimes the case that the permissibility claim is false. But even if we concede that the use of the fairly primitive laws now available could be a violation of the principle of discrimination, it does not follow that the same will be true of the use of future laws. Along these lines, consider a somewhat complicated scenario that I'll call case one. So Alpha Stan is fighting a just war against Betaville. Gamma, an officer in Alpha Stan's military, has the opportunity to capture Point Delta, which is necessary to Alpha Stan's efforts to accomplish its just war aims. However, the only soldiers available to Gamma at the moment are in Company Epsilon. Gamma believes that these warfighters will violate the principle of discrimination if they are ordered to take Point Delta. Nevertheless, Gamma can instead use highly sophisticated laws to take Point Delta. These futuristic laws can distinguish between combatants and non-combatants with a high degree of accuracy, thereby vastly lowering the risk of a violation of the principle of discrimination. It seems to me that it's permissible on the basis of considerations of human dignity for Gamma to use their laws instead of the soldiers in Company Epsilon to take Point Delta. This fact weighs against the understanding the permissibility claim as always false, as prohibitionists maintain. Or, to put the matter a little differently, if my judgment is correct, then it's sometimes permissible on the grounds of human dignity to use laws. Now consider a second case. I'll tell you, I've only got 3 cases, so relax, it's not going to get much worse. So here we are, case 2. This case is similar to case 1, except that by taking Point Delta, Gamma can prevent large-scale assaults on the basic human dignity of a group of non-combatants, which Gamma is certain will otherwise occur as a result of the actions of their adversary. Plausibly, on the basis of considerations of human dignity, it is not only permissible, but required for gamma to use their highly sophisticated laws instead of their soldiers to take point delta. In case two, for only by using these laws, which do not themselves violate the principle of discrimination, can gamma prevent the large-scale assaults on the human dignity of many non-combatants. If gamma is required to do so, then there are at least some situations in which the requirement claim is true, a fact that's consistent with weak restrictionism, but not prohibitionism. Now, it might be objected that the two thought experiments I've offered rely too heavily on warfighters being incapable or unwilling to act on the principle of discrimination. So consider what I'll call the maximalist extension of the principle of discrimination. Here's this extension. If one can employ several means, M sub 1, M sub 2, M sub n, and so forth, to achieve an otherwise morally legitimate military objective, one of the means, M sub I, is more likely than any of the other means to distinguish non-combatants from enemy combatants while not targeting the former for harm, then there's a prima facie reason to use M sub I, since, to use M sub I rather than any other means. The reason to favor M sub I is only prima facie, right? Since there might be countervailing reasons of other kinds in play. Nevertheless, if the maximalist extension of the principle of discrimination is correct, then there are more possible circumstances in which the use of laws is not only permissible, but required by considerations of human dignity. And consider the promised third case. This is similar to case 2. However, gamma can also use company zeta to take point delta to avoid widespread assaults on human dignity, where company zeta, unlike company epsilon, would be unlikely to violate the principle of discrimination in the process. However, gamma could instead use a highly advanced form of laws to take point delta. This laws is even more likely than the members of company zeta to distinguish accurately between enemy combatants and non-combatants and to avoid targeting non-combatants for harm. In the absence of any countervailing considerations, I think gamma is required by considerations of human dignity to use laws in case 3, since it will achieve the same end of avoiding assaults on human dignity and do so by employing a means that's less likely to be a violation of human dignity by being a violation of the principle of discrimination. More generally, case 3 points to a surprising conclusion. Even in circumstances where it's possible to meet human standards of discrimination, the continued development of technology and artificial intelligence might make it the case that we're required nevertheless to use laws precisely because doing so is more reliably discriminate. Warfighters might be all they can be, yet still not be enough to do what they're required to do in light of the alternatives. In such cases, it might be that human moral virtue must take a backseat to inhuman technological excellence. Now, one of the conceits of this paper is that it's possible that there will be laws that are better than humans, perhaps far better than humans, with respect to distinguishing combatants from non-combatants in the battle space. Implicitly, I've assumed that laws can do many other things better than humans can to avoid violations of human dignity as well. These ideas are far from new. However, they're also far from being true in our world as I read this sentence here in April 2022. Currently, there are few, if any, contexts in which it would be reasonable to expect laws consistently to perform better than well-trained and conscientious human combatants with respect to discrimination. Moreover, it's impossible to say with certainty when, or perhaps even if, laws will become robust and competent enough to be deployed in combat without meaningful human control. So it's natural to wonder. Whether introducing the possibility of futuristic laws does anything to advance the conversation. Let me conclude this little talk by explaining why all of this matters. If prohibitionists are correct, then considerations of human dignity require us to halt research and development into laws, since they cannot be used in a matter that's consistent with human dignity. For that reason, they should not be developed, and all our energy should go into banning their use. Recall from the beginning of this paper, Peter Assaro's insistence that, quote, We should respect this, i.e. human dignity, by prohibiting autonomous weapons systems. But if weak restrictionists are correct, then considerations of human dignity actually require further research into and development of laws, since there are possible circumstances in which human dignity demands their use. Furthermore, if weak restrictionists are right, considerations of human dignity at least partially ought to set the agenda for how laws are to be developed. It also ought to inform any and all attempts to regulate the development and use of laws at the international level. So the implications of the two views are very different, and the fact that the laws that I've used in these thought experiments in this talk are not yet extant is no objection. As I implied a few moments ago, this talk is just a small window into this year's Stockdale seminar and what I in particular have learned from it. Of course, there's a lot more to be said about the topic than I've managed to get to today. But I think it's best if I leave it here for now. I'll just wrap up by thanking you for your attention and saying I look forward to continuing the conversation.
So I'll follow Leonard's example to take a minute to thank the Naval Academy and the Stockdale Center for providing me with a resident fellowship this year. I've learned a lot, and it's been enjoyable and a very nice change of pace. So thank you. So my presentation also is on lethal autonomous weapon systems or laws, but it's on a little bit of a different track of argument than the main one that Duncan Purvis emphasized this morning and Leonard just talked about. So I hope I'm not being too repetitive. The topic is lethal autonomous weapon systems or laws. And what's distinctive about them is that they select targets and use force with humans not being in the loop or on the loop. And there's some, well-known, often made arguments for and against use of lethal autonomous weapon systems. For the moment, as Leonard said, they're not as good, just technologically they're not as good at discriminating between legitimate and not legitimate targets as humans. So there's not much question about right now, should we massively employ laws in warfare. But presumably sometime fairly soon, they might be better than humans at distinguishing between legitimate and non-legitimate targets, in which case that's a reason, certainly, to think that we ought to use autonomous weapon systems rather than having humans in the loop who will make more mistakes. So both Duncan and Leonard identify that one main line of argument against using lethal autonomous weapon systems, even if they become better at discriminating targets than humans are, is that somehow, people argue, lethal autonomous weapon systems show developing them and deploying them is disrespectful of humans or fails to recognize the dignity of humans who are their targets. The idea being something like this, right? Respect for dignity requires a sort of individual recognition and examination of a person and a consideration of whether it's really justified to take the person's life. And a machine can't do that, so just intrinsically, laws are disrespectful of human dignity. Some people find this line of argument, it seems very, very intuitively persuasive, and other people not at all. So there's kind of a stalemate, and there's a common response to that line of argument as well, which is basically, look, how is this different from a cruise missile? or artillery or a bomb drop from a plane. They're just weapons. So is a lethal autonomous weapons system. Right? A cruise missile or a bomb drop from a plane isn't individually examining each target and deciding that it's justified to take a life. So there's a kind of stalemate. Some people find this line of argument very persuasive, other people not at all. So I think because of that, Robert Sparrow, in an article in 2016, tries a sort of different line of argument to escape that stalemate. And his line of argument is roughly the following, right? We don't really need to sort out a reason, a theoretical moral philosophy sort of reason, why laws fail to respect human dignity. All we need is an empirical fact about human attitudes, which is many people feel a sort of revulsion at the idea of machines autonomously deciding to take human life. If lots of people feel this deep revulsion or repugnance at the idea of lethal autonomous weapons systems, then it's disrespectful to develop and deploy them. Why? Because you're ignoring these human feelings of deep revulsion and repugnance at doing this. Okay, so it makes it depend not on an argument that laws actually fail to respect human dignity. Instead, it says roughly this. It says, well, there's a widespread feeling that developing and using laws will fail to respect human dignity, and in fact, people feel a kind of moral repulsion or repugnance at the idea of using laws. And to ignore these kinds of feelings of deep repugnance is disrespectful to humans. Therefore, to continue developing laws and eventually deploy them against humans is disrespectful to humans. Okay, so that's, I think, how the argument was supposed to go. An obvious question is there such a widespread feeling of repugnance or revulsion at developing lethal autonomous weapons systems and using them? I think there's room to doubt that. I'm going to grant it for the sake of argument, but I'll just take a minute or two to talk about it first. Right, Sparrow's position depends on saying there's a deep, how does he describe it? A deep and widespread aversion or repugnance to the development and use of lethal autonomous weapons systems. But his evidence is not so conclusive. He mentions a poll that was taken in 2013, and there's more recent polls that I've found taken within the last couple of years, but all of them basically ask the same question. They don't ask, do you feel a deep moral revulsion at the idea of autonomous weapons taking human lives? They ask, should your country develop lethal autonomous weapons systems? And I think in every country, it varies from country to country. I think in every country, a majority says no, they shouldn't develop lethal autonomous weapons systems. But you can correct me, there might be some countries where a majority says yes, we should develop them. But obviously, answering that question, should they develop these systems, doesn't answer the question, do you feel a deep moral revulsion at the idea? Because people might have all kinds of reasons for saying, no, we shouldn't develop them. In fact, just in a very unscientific, at me asking people I know about it, most people, if I ask them this question, I explain, I'm not talking about drones that are remotely controlled, but if there were machines that actually decided who to target and when to fire, do you think those should be developed? Most people I've asked say no, and I say, how come? And they say, well, there might be mistakes. Right? And then I say, well, suppose it was more effective at discriminating targets than a human soldier or operator. And they say, oh, I don't know, maybe. Right? So it doesn't seem like that question he's relying on in the poll really shows what he thinks it does about deep feelings of moral repugnance. Nevertheless, I mean, obviously some people do feel this deep repugnance. I mean, there's authors who obviously do. I don't think they're faking. And, well, I mean, the Campaign to Stop Killer Robots, if you look at their website and their publicity, it's totally like this sort of repugnance-based thing. They won't identify with you. They won't recognize your identity as a human. They don't care about your preferences. They don't care about you as a person. They just want to destroy you, right? So some people at least have this feeling of repugnance. So let's just grant, for the sake of argument, that it's widespread, and then see what follows from that. So, is a widespread feeling of moral repugnance a good reason to act or to prohibit some kind of policy? Some people think not. So, in response to Sparrow, Purvis, and Jenkins, it's weird, he's sitting right there, and yet I'm say basically that it doesn't seem like major policy decisions should be based on unjustified moral distinctions or something along those lines. And you might think of examples or thought experiments that seem to support that, right? So suppose country A and country B are at war, and country B issues a declaration that says, look, we're going to obey the rules of jus in bello, but we just ask that you only send troops against us of Northern European descent because we don't want these other kinds of people killing us. That would be disrespectful to us. And you might think, why would I give any weight to that kind of racist, unjustified feeling of repugnance? But there's other kinds of examples too. So here's a different one, right? Suppose country B says, look, we're at war, we're going to obey the rules of jus in bello, but we have this long-standing traditional aversion to copper and we think it's impure, so we just ask that copper munitions not be used against us. Well, if there were some equally good alternative that didn't use copper, was just as effective and available, it seems like maybe you'd give some weight to that, right? Respect might require all things being equal to give weight to that repugnance they have. So I think what's really going on is it's not a simple yes or no answer to the question, should we give great weight to people's feelings of moral repugnance? It depends on what we think of their views and the basis of their feelings, right? So if you think, well, that's just racist, then your policy can express that I give no weight to that at all. I disapprove of racism. Where if it's something else, you might think, well, all right, I give some weight to their preferences. So then applying that to this supposed widespread feeling of moral revulsion at at the use of lethal autonomous weapon systems, what should we think of that? Well, I think it helps here to distinguish two different kinds of respect. Right? So there's a kind of respect that plays a deep foundational role in moral theory. The philosopher Tom Hill calls it basic respect. The philosopher Stephen Darwall calls it recognition, respect for persons. Right? And this is the deep theoretical idea of respect that's connected with dignity. People even talk about respecting human dignity. And it's the kind of respect that is embodied in sets of principles like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So it's a very, important and profound kind of respect. And it seems like the right view about that kind of respect is either you can't violate it at all. I mean, it's wrong to fail to show that kind of respect for persons at all. Right? That's the point of universal human rights. Or it requires a really, really strong justification, right? Like, well, we should save all these people, but we can't, so we should save as many as we can. Okay, so that's one kind of respect. Another kind of respect, though, is just a respect for convention or a symbolic kind of respect. So, for example, there might be some culture where they consider it rude to touch people you don't know with your left hand or to handle objects publicly with your left hand. And so then if the question is, well, so is it disrespectful if you go to that culture to handle things with your left hand? Well, yeah, right? I mean, it seems like that's a symbolic kind of respect. You should show all things being equal. But it's much more defeasible than this deep recognition respect for persons. I mean, yeah, so be respectful, so don't handle things with your left hand, but if somebody's stuck in a burning car, you might have to pull them out with both hands, and that's just obviously kind of more important. So armed with these two different kinds of respect, one, deep moral respect for human dignity, and the other, just sort of symbolic respect or conventional respect, at least most of the time, it seems if they conflict, the deep respect for persons is more important. So what I think the right view is about this argument that Sparrow gives, which is supposedly people have a widespread, deep feeling of moral revulsion at the idea of lethal autonomous weapons systems. We should respect that, which means don't develop such systems, don't use such systems. I think the right thing to think is, well, that's just a kind of symbolic respect for what people happen to think. That's a reason not to do something, like it's a reason not to develop lethal autonomous weapons systems, but it's a reason that might easily be overridden by some other consideration, like if lethal autonomous weapons systems are better at discriminating between legitimate and non-legitimate targets, that seems to have more to do with the deeply important sort of moral recognition respect for persons. And so that might be a reason that outweighs this sort of conventional respect for people's attitudes. I think that's all. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. This is the last one, I promise. You're free to go after this. Actually, you're free to go now. It's fine. I'd also like to thank everybody that Richard and Leonard thanked, except for Leonard. And the main reason is that we were all deciding whether to be at the podium or at the table. As you can see, there are microphones at the table. And Leonard, by being the first mover, decided that he wanted to be at the podium. So now I got to stand up, and I really don't want to do that. So I'd like to thank everyone at the Naval Academy and the Stockdale Center, and all of my fellow fellows, except for Leonard. All right. So I want to talk about responsibility gaps. Boo. All right. So but I don't really want to talk about solving responsibility gaps. I don't want to show how AI systems are actually responsible or something like that. What I want to do is I want to sort of dissolve the underlying premises that make us care about responsibility gaps and what generate the problem. And in particular, I think what we get a lot in AI ethics, and this is something that happens a lot in applied ethics in general, is that we have a set of stock ethical concepts, autonomy, responsibility, harm, whatever it is, and then we apply it to the new case. But I think there is a reason to think that new technologies, new contexts can reveal the inadequacies of our prior concepts. And so we have to think about whether our concepts have been disrupted by the new case. Now, you can do a bunch of different spins on this. You can say that our concepts change, and this is a big concept nowadays in terms of techno-moral change, that the technology changes our values. Or you could say that the technology reveals that our prior concepts were inadequate to cover the relevant moral considerations. I'm not here to sort of lay out the meta-ethical ways of thinking about this, but I do think in general it could be the case that new circumstances can reveal that there was something inadequate or something that needs to be revised about our existing concepts. It's not merely about applying our pre-existing concepts to the new cases. And for this, I want to focus on responsibility. In particular, I want to sort of make an argument or sketch out a different way of understanding responsibility. So instead of thinking about responsibility as an individual feature of myself, I intentionally make some kind of causal contribution to some outcome, and we kind of determine the nature of my individual moral responsibility. I think we should think of responsibility, at least sometimes, as a political concept. And that is, responsibility is something that is distributed by a system. Right? So, and the question we should ask is not whether I fit the specific agential requirements of being responsible for my actions. We should ask whether a fair or just system would distribute responsibility to me for those outcomes. And those are not the same thing, right? So I guess I want to say here that there's a difference between essentially adopting a pre-political account of responsibility and then one that I call a constructivist political account of responsibility, where we ask, what would a fair system make me responsible for? All right, and in particular, I want to give an account of how that might work in practice when it comes to AI. But since it's at the end of the day, I'm going to motivate this not by giving you some elaborate account of Rawlsian institutionalism, which I can already see people are just bored by the very idea, and so I don't think anyone's excited about talking about Rawlsian institutionalism as I am, so I'm going to spare you that. Instead, I'm going to tell you a story that will illustrate why I came at this. So a few years ago, I was at SWAMOS, which is the Summer Workshop for the Analysis of Military Operations and Strategy. It's a 3-week intensive summer workshop at Cornell, and the idea is to make social scientists and humanities scholars that are interested in military matters to familiarize them with sort of military concepts. I am the only philosopher in the history of as applied to this program. I highly recommend that people go. It's a lot of fun, except for the fact that the person who runs it really only requires that you drink Yingling, which I think is unfortunate. I kind of like Yingling, but 3 weeks of it is too much. It's too much. Too much. But anyway, so you do things. So for example, we start at the Grand Strategic. We start at, so you read Clausewitz, of course, and then you start at the Grand Strategic level and the strategic level, and then operationally, we plan patents, sort of move northward at the Battle of the Bulge, and we go pour over maps and things like that. And we even do essentially we have a Army, I think it was an Army captain who kind of run us through attack plan for ambushing a convoy. I got yelled at for making my attack plan too fancy because I wanted to use reverse slopes and only Marines do that. S word, I'm not going to say the rest of it, but only Marines do that. And so I was like, I thought that's fine. But I learned it from Napoleon. I don't know what you're talking, or Wellington. I don't know what you're talking about. But one of the things we did one day is a person came from a defense consultant agency, and he brought his tactical simulator, which involves manipulating soldiers, tanks, various things, and sort of testing out various doctrinal attempts, but also leadership decisions, weapons mixes, this kind of thing. And we basically end up kind of doing a competition. And I was a pretty good StarCraft player back in college. I don't know if that's a brag. I don't think it is because it shows that I am quite the nerd. But I was quite a good StarCraft player back in the day. So I was rolling through this, right? This was my jam. I was doing very well. I came up with a guy who was the consultant, and we were going back, and I was winning, and he just drops a huge artillery bombardment right on a church. All right, right on a church, and wipes out a particular, and the process wipes out some units of mine and ends up winning. And I was like, that's not, you just bombed a church. And I was like, so don't you lose points for killing the civilians? And he was like, oh, there are no civilians in this simulator, right? No, you can't kill civilians in the simulator. And I was like, well, then how do you know whether you're killing too many civilians? He's like, the lawyers figure it out afterwards, right? Was his argument, right? And I was like, well, that seems like the wrong attitude, right? And notice this has nothing to do with AI. It has nothing to do with AI at all, right? And this is what I want to get at. Responsibility gaps and thinking about distributed responsibility, or what's called the many hands problem, is a problem of the modern military system. It's not a problem of AI. And you can easily imagine an accretion of bad decisions through the various mechanisms of the defense industrial ecological system that results in a teenager in Afghanistan being put in a situation where they make a bad decision and kill someone. And then the individual moral responsibility view is like, well, the 18-year-old needs to go to jail for the war crime. And you're like, well, maybe that's true, but the teenager was there because a lot of other people made a lot of bad decisions that are now illegible to this particular kind of responsibility. And so I'm not going to tell you, there's attempts by people who do personal responsibility to try and solve this problem, which also involve basically more and more sophisticated attempts of like, well, this person is 18% responsible and this person's 34% responsible. I can talk about why I'm skeptical of those accounts being successful, but instead I'm just going to use this example to motivate you. So I want to talk about something where responsibility, and this includes, going to Jovana's point, liability for legal accountability, or defensive harm, or also things like social opprobrium, or other kinds of. I want to basically talk about all these as responsibility mandates, right? So these are all different things that could be distributed differentially. So sometimes we might say you're responsible in the sense that you are subject to losing out on your career, or you're subject to a norm of social opprobrium, or even you're legally accountable. And I want to talk about how would we look at the defense industrial ecosystem as a whole and create a coherent understanding of how to distribute responsibility amongst the various elements, so that the consultant does not feel completely free of any kind of responsibility for mitigating or reducing civilian or collateral damage. So how do we do that? And I think one way to think about this is to think of the defense industrial ecosystem as a cooperative enterprise. So people who know Rawls are going to say, okay, now we know that this is a structure that is a cooperative enterprise, and we can ask the question, how does this enterprise achieve its outcomes and distribute its benefits and burdens in a fair way? All right, so I'm taking that to be that's the question that I want to pursue, which is different from, am I personally morally responsible for the particular action? I'm less interested in that question. I'm more interested in the fair distribution question. And so this, in a sense, dissolves the problem responsibility gaps, because we can just ask ourselves, what's the best way to think about distributing responsibility? We don't have to, so responsibility gaps are driven by the idea that people lack certain agential feature, whether it's causal responsibility or whether it's intentionality or something like that. The commander, the programmer, and the AI system, none of them have the relevant preconditions for individual moral responsibility, so there's a responsibility gap. I dissolve that problem. I don't solve it. I don't show that they do have moral responsibility. I'm saying once we re-understand responsibility in this political sense, we can just assign responsibility to whomever we want. Right? Because there's no prior agential precondition for assigning responsibility. It's just what is going to be effective and fair at producing the outcomes that we care about. Right? And so I think that we have to think about responsibility this way, and I think it's important to think about responsibility this way when we're dealing with really complex bureaucratic or causal undertakings. So spoiler alert for people who are interested in other papers that I'm writing, I'm really interested in this in the context of responsibility for climate change impacts, right? Because you're like, so this is, by the way, this is what climate ethicists do. They're like, well, okay, so it turns out that climate change is going to cause 4 million deaths, and I am responsible for 1/8 millionth of the emissions, so I'm responsible for half a death a person. I'm not making this up. This is an actual paper, right? And so you're like, what a complete misunderstanding of what the relevant issues are, and we can talk about why that is later on. But this is what I want to get at. In complex institutional settings in which people's preferences are entwined and my rational behavior depends upon the incentives that you create and vice versa, it doesn't make sense to think about our individual moral responsibility in this way. Rather, I want to say, what is your individual responsibility in terms of what would be assigned by a fair basic structure? And so the way to think about this is, and so I'm just going to quickly go over how this might work and how this might work. And what I want to suggest is that we first have to divide up classes of individuals. And think about these individual classes in terms of their risk profile, causal contribution, and relative privilege within the system, right? So the consultant might not have a really strong causal contribution, but they also have a very low risk profile, right? Politicians, for example, have a very high causal contribution because if they decide whether to go to war or not, but also a relatively low risk profile, whereas the 18-year-old might have a lot of causal contribution in terms of like firing the weapon, but also has a really high risk profile and is relatively powerless within the system. So these are various things that we'd want. So we'd create representative classes of individuals using these various profiles. And then we ask ourselves in classic sort of Rawlsian fashion, if I didn't know who I was going to be, how would I want to distribute responsibility within the system? So I say, okay, so I don't know if I'm going to be the 18-year-old in Fallujah. I don't know if I'm going to be a politician. I don't know if I'm going to be a contractor. I don't know which class I'm going to be a member of. How would I assign responsibility? And how would I assign responsibility? So this, I think, makes it very clear why we would tell the 18-year-old you can't shoot the surrendered person or the civilian. You can't intentionally target the civilian because we say this because we would say it would be a low-cost way of generating the outcomes we care about, and that's a separate issue, which I would say defense of people against aggression and things like that. But we'd say, or protection of basic rights or from standard threats and things like that. We'd say a low-cost way to protect one of the relevant classes from harm against their basic rights is to say, once I've surrendered or once I'm a vulnerable innocent civilian, you can't kill me, right? So that was and why would I do it? Because if I knew I could be a civilian, I would veto any principle that allowed people to just massacre civilians. See why that would be the case? Because I'd be like, I could be one of them, and I don't want to be massacred, right? On the other hand, would I assign all the relevant responsibility, all the legal accountability for the war crime? Would I assign all of them to the 18-year-old trigger puller in Fallujah or Afghanistan? No, I wouldn't, right? Because I would veto that as the 18-year-old if I was a member of that particular class. Now, this means we'd have to think about what the relevant principles are, and we can go over that in the Q&A. But that would involve sort of very fine, detailed work of looking at what the specific risk profiles are for the individual classes, how we would differentiate the individual classes, and things like that. But one thing I would say is that we could ask ourselves, what would be the least cost way of generating it? That's one possibility. But we'd say least cost is tricky in a variety of ways. One, because we'd have to have an interesting account of what the costs are, right? But the other thing is that the least cost way of solving a problem can nonetheless be extremely costly to relatively underprivileged groups within the system. Right? So let's say there's a way of avoiding a particular cost, a particular negative outcome that costs $1,000, right? Versus $1,000 to a poor person versus $1,001 to a very rich person. I think we'd have good reasons to prefer the $1,001 to the rich person over the $1,000 to the poor person based upon those least costs. Of course, you could probably solve that by saying that there's a least cost. Oh, running late. Okay, all right. I'm going to stop right there. But the one thing I want to get across is that you don't have to agree with any of the principles or the specific account, but what I'm trying to really justify here is a sort of political conception of responsibility and how that has some promise for solving responsibility gaps, both at the AI level and in just the regular sort of many hands military context. All right, that's all I got. Thanks a lot, everybody.
Okay, I see a number of hands. Sir in back. No, yes.
Hi, Midshipman Henderson. So one of the panels at the beginning of the day spoke about how our ethical considerations and priorities and values go into informing the mathematical algorithms that are produced by artificial intelligence and ultimately how we refine the output further. Mm-hmm. So my question is, when working on global problems that require mass partnership, specifically between entities whose values aren't always shared. These could be global problems like public health, the environment, global population issues. How do we share and collaborate with the use of artificial intelligence when our ethical priorities might not align, yet we're still expected to work together and at the same time utilize modern solutions? Thank you.
Boy.
Who wants to take this?
That's pretty hard. But I'm gonna, well, I guess one thing I would, so maybe the one thing I would say is that there's a famous quote about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I think it was a Catholic theologian that said, "We all agree about human rights as long as no one asks us why." And I think that there's probably some space for what's called an overlapping consensus on the solution to some of these problems that allow us to get together on the parts that we do agree with, even if there's also going to be elements that we don't agree to. But that's often a political problem where we think about, okay, so can we, so it's clearly true that that the United States is not going to respond to COVID exactly the same way as China, and because there are importantly different values at stake. But there are going to be some ways in which there is agreement and coordination. And I think that's really where there's been a sort of failure of leadership at the international level, is to sort of get people coordinated on the things that they can agree with as long as we don't talk about. And I think this is something that happens. You just have to learn, to a certain extent, learn to compartmentalize away the things that you can't agree on. And I think that's often a difficult part of diplomacy, but I think it's something that's unavoidable in the current context.
Two quick follow-ups on that. I think the person you've got in mind was Ancien Gilson.
Can you lean into the microphone?
I think the person you had in mind was Ancien Gilson. Yeah, I think that's right. Mm-hmm. That's the minor point. The slightly more substantive point is this. I think those kinds of coordination problems are problems that exist and would continue to exist without artificial intelligence being introduced into the mix. But it's likely the case that there are complications, considerable complications that come in as a result of getting artificial intelligence in the mix, especially if they rise to the level of agents or quasi-agents. Then you have to worry about coordination not just with other nations, other individuals, but with these quasi-agents who have kind of aims that they pursue. So yeah, it can get very messy. Although it seems likely that the best way forward would be by using what means we already employ to try to render those coordination problems less difficult.
Yeah, thank you very much for your presentations. I'm Dan Saxon, and my question is for Patrick. I appreciated your presentation, but I'd like to push back a little bit on what you said about we need to think about responsibility or accountability differently. We need to think about it, and the difference, the way I understood you, is that we need to look at it as a political construct where responsibility is distributed through a system. And in all full disclosure, I need to confess, I've spent a lot of my career prosecuting war criminals. Mm-hmm. So I've been a bit I spent a lot of time trying to figure out what level of responsibility to try to assign both to low-level soldiers and commanders. And it's been my understanding that such a system of accountability where responsibility is distributed already exists. For example, in 1977, the additional protocols to the Geneva Conventions were promulgated, and there were a couple of articles added that, for the first time, codified so-called commander or superior responsibility, because there was consensus that commanders, even also civilian superiors, are in a particularly important position to ensure that their subordinates act appropriately. And so, for example, in the different international war crimes tribunals that have existed over the last 20 years, if you look at the sentencing judgments, usually military commanders, civilian politicians, superiors, the sentences that they receive, the punishments they receive if they're convicted, will be higher, for example, than the lowly conscript. So I'm just trying to understand what exactly is the difference, the different system that you're proposing versus what already exists today.
Well, so one thing is that one way to sort of put this is that I do think this happens. In legal context, right? So I'm talking about the underlying understanding of moral responsibility. So I do think legal responsibility does this. I think. The example that I use in my paper is sort of strict liability in the context of tort law, right? Where you just say, look, there's just an important public policy advantage for distributing responsibility in this way, legal responsibility in this way, and so we do. And so legal responsibility is amongst the things that are going to be distributed. So one way in which my view is different from that view is that I'm thinking about a wide variety of different ways of holding people responsible. One of which is legal responsibility, is we might say legal accountability. And so I think that's the other thing. And the other thing is that for me, it's sort of, I want to sort of treat what we might say sort of social norms of responsibility and legal responsibility as all of a piece, of a continuum of responses. And so sometimes it would be counterproductive or unfair to assign legal responsibility to certain people, but it would be fair if we assign social responsibility. But what normally happens in these debates is that social responsibility is like guided by sort of this underlying sort of Darwinian or really Straussonian kind of norms, and then legal responsibility then there's a big debate about whether legal responsibility should track moral responsibility or should track public policy or something like that. So I guess I want to sort of take the reasoning that is often part of the legal community and then apply it to responsibility discussions in general. So for example, I don't have any problem with holding Yamashita responsible, but I don't think there's really an account of underlying moral responsibility that would say Yamashita was responsible for what happened in the Philippines once he moved into the mountains. But I say from a legal perspective, I'm happy from a political perspective to hold him legally accountable for what he did for much of the reasons that you described. So I guess I want to say is I want to take the way lawyers have thought about this. I want to strengthen the normative underpinnings of what the public policy goals are going to be, and then apply it to a broader continuum of holding responsible.
I see one more question, and I think then we are going to have to end for the day. So.
Hi, Ilya Rudyak, Center for Ethics and the Rule of Law, University of Pennsylvania. I'm aware of the time, so I'm going to do it short. I have a question about discussions of responsibility and human dignity in the context of AI tend to focus on the human dignity of either the enemy or civilians on the other side. And I just am interested in your thoughts about whether we have responsibility to respect the human dignity of the soldiers that we are sending to the war, and then perhaps a requirement to deploy artificial intelligence aided systems or autonomous weapons instead of soldiers to save them from the act of killing and the danger.
Since it's late, I'll give you a short answer. Yes.
And I think I'd say that this is an advantage of my system. I think that it is sometimes extraordinarily high levels of holding people to extraordinarily high levels of personal responsibility, and then not generating the relevant preconditions, especially political and social preconditions for them to do it properly, is itself a disrespectful way to treat a person. And I think this happens a lot in military contexts, right? Where we don't, that doesn't mean that we would never assign individual legal accountability to the individual soldiers, But I think it's really, I call it the reverse Nuremberg defense in Abu Ghraib, right? Which is where the people at the higher ups were like, say, we didn't do the torturing, we were only giving the orders, right? And then somehow that escapes prosecution or responsibility. And I'm like, that's that way of structuring the accountability, that the people who put the soldiers who did the torturing in a position where someone was almost certainly going to torture somebody. It doesn't mean we don't hold the torturers responsible, but it also means that the failure to hold the people who are, in some sense, other people responsible, was a way of treating everybody else in the system with disrespect. I would say, but that would be sort of one of the underlying, yeah.
So yes.
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
But even more. Yes, but even more.
Thank you so much for that. I want to single you out for thanks there.
Did you want to add anything, Richard?
Well, I mean, sure, in one way that concerned with the dignity of your own country's military, one way that's gotten more attention recently, of course, is concern about moral injury. And yeah, I think that seems like a reason in favor of not putting your own people in a position of doing things that would cause moral injury. And then I suppose that gives rise to a sort of larger scale concern about, well, but maybe there is something problematic about keeping people's hands too clean, and it makes it more tempting to take military solutions rather than other solutions.
So avoiding moral injury and creating moral hazard. Well, thanks. Ed, I think you are up now. So, yeah.
You can see how well we got along this year. But I want to thank the panel and thank all of you for staying late in the conference on a Friday afternoon. And just also thank, very quickly, this is going to sound like the Academy Awards or something, but I do need to thank a few people. Just building this conference, I consulted with a variety of people, some of whom are still here. Dave Barnes, Jesse Kirkpatrick, Mitt Regan, Martin Cook, who's left, Jim Giordano, Henrik Sison, Greg Reichberg, of course, and Tony Pfaff. So it was a collaboration to get the themes set and the speakers also. And then, of course, the fellows put so much time into this and good ideas. Richard Dean, Jovana, is Jovana still here? I think she's still here. Thanks. Leonard Kahn, Patrick Smith, and of course David. You always insightful. So that's all the people that helped build the conference. Executing it, obviously Karen, you've seen out in the front, she's handled so many details perfectly, yes. And then, of course, Sarah, who's handled the finances and the microphones, and Taylor Heflin in the back also. We're going to be sorry to see you go. And also the heroes behind the glass there, they've done a great job. Anya, Carlos, and Arnica, just flawless job. Yeah, great. Okay, and so thank you all. And the Deputy Director, Jeff McCrease, would just like to send us off.
Yeah, thanks very much, Dr. Barrett. Appreciate it. Well, this does conclude the 2022 McCain Conference, where our theme has been artificial intelligence. We'd like to recognize Bloomberg Philanthropies, whose generous grant makes these get-togethers possible each and every year. This conference represents perhaps the highlight of everything that we do at the Stockdale Center. And we'd like to think that both Senator John McCain, for whom this conference is named, and the eponym of the center, Vice Admiral James Stockdale, will be very proud that we take pause for 2 days every year to ponder the enormous implications of ethics and the military profession. We'd like to think that this collection here of scholars represents one of the highlights of worldwide conversations on ethics in the military. And so although we draw to a close this 2022 evolution, we do invite you back in 2023, where our tentative topic is going to be character education, and character assessment in military affairs. In keeping with naval tradition, until next year, we wish you fair winds and following seas, and we hope to see you again in 2023. Thank you.